When people talk about encounters with the supernatural, there's often an air of skepticism. I was once one of those people who would listen to such stories and politely nod, secretly brushing them off as exaggerations or overactive imaginations. But that was before I faced the horrors of a jinn, a malevolent entity so terrifying that even recounting the events now sends shivers down my spine. It began innocently enough, with a visit to my family's ancestral home in the outskirts of a small remote village. The house was ancient, its stone walls weathered by time and the stories of countless generations. My grandparents had passed away years ago, and the house was left to decay in eerie silence. It was only recently that my parents decided it was time to renovate it, hoping to preserve the family legacy. They sent me ahead to oversee the early stages of work. I agreed, thinking it would be a brief and uneventful trip. I was wrong. Arriving at the house was like stepping into another world. The surrounding forest seemed alive, whispering in a language only it understood. The house itself had an oppressive presence, with windows that felt like watchful eyes and shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The villagers greeted me with wary smiles, their words laced with cryptic warnings. "Don't disturb what doesn't want to be disturbed," one old man said, his voice low and trembling. I brushed it off as local superstition and made my way inside. Inside, the house was a tomb of memories. Dust-coated furniture, faded photographs, and the faint smell of mildew greeted me. Yet there was something else, a strange heaviness in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. That first night, I lay awake in the room that had once belonged to my grandfather. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard it, a faint whispering sound, like someone murmuring in the next room. I froze. The murmuring grew louder, distinct yet incomprehensible. Gathering my courage, I grabbed my phone for light and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, biting against my skin. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the kitchen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. I stepped into the kitchen, heart pounding, and found it empty. But as I turned to leave, a sharp sound echoed behind me, the distinct clatter of a plate falling from the counter. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The plate lay shattered on the floor, and the room was as still as death. I convinced myself it was nothing, a gust of wind perhaps, or a mouse scurrying about. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I mentioned the incident to one of the workers helping with the renovation. His face went pale, and he hesitated before speaking. "This house has a history," he said. "Your family may have forgotten, but the village hasn't. They say something was summoned here long ago, something that should never have been disturbed." I laughed nervously, brushing off his words. But his expression didn't change. He handed me a small amulet, a tarnished piece of silver inscribed with strange symbols. "Keep this with you," he said. "You'll need it." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I clutched the amulet tightly, its cool surface offering a small measure of comfort. That night the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me in a cacophony of voices. Then came the knocking, 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the bedroom door. I froze in terror, clutching the amulet. The knocks came again, louder this time. Trembling, I forced myself to the door and flung it open, expecting to find someone, or something, on the other side. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the air heavy with a suffocating silence. As I stepped back into the room, the door slammed shut behind me with such force that the windows rattled. I screamed, stumbling back against the bed. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the darkness itself, standing in the corner of the room. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, 2 pinpricks of malevolent light, bored into me with a hatred so intense it felt as though my very soul was being pierced. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. When I finally found the strength to move, I grabbed my belongings and bolted from the room. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frenzied as I fled the house. I spent the night in the village, too terrified to return, The villagers took me in, their faces grim but unsurprised. "You've seen it now," one of them said. "The Jinn." They explained that the house had a history of strange occurrences, dating back decades. My great-grandfather, they said, had dabbled in things he shouldn't have, rituals meant to summon and bind a Jinn to do his bidding. But the ritual had gone wrong, leaving the entity free to roam the house and torment anyone who dared enter. The next day, armed with the amulet and the guidance of a local cleric, I returned to the house. The cleric performed a cleansing ritual, reciting verses and burning incense meant to banish the Jinn. For a moment it seemed to work. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house felt lighter. But that night the whispers returned, louder and angrier than before. The Jinn was not gone. It was furious. If I thought the events of the first night were terrifying, nothing could prepare me for what came next. The oppressive presence in my family's ancestral home escalated from whispers and shadows to outright malice. The Jinn wasn't just haunting the house, it was hunting me. After the initial cleansing ritual performed by the cleric, I returned to the house cautiously. The air felt lighter, as if a suffocating weight had been lifted. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope that the worst was behind me. I spent the morning clearing out old furniture and boxes, determined to reclaim the space from the entity that had terrorized me. As I worked, I found myself drawn to the attic, a part of the house I had avoided thus far. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with relics of my family's past. Among the old trunks and faded photographs, I discovered a small, locked chest. Its exterior was carved with intricate patterns, similar to the symbols on the amulet the villager had given me. Something about the chest unnerved me, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a bundle of aged papers and a small leather-bound book. The book was written in a language I couldn't fully understand, though some sections were scrawled in Arabic. My limited knowledge of the language allowed me to pick out a few words: spirit, control, and curse. One of the papers, however, was written in English. It was a letter from my great-grandfather, addressed to my grandfather. I write this as a warning. What I attempted was a mistake. The entity I summoned was not a servant, but a demon. It is bound to this house, and its wrath is unending. If you value your life, do not disturb it. Leave it alone. A chill ran through me. My great-grandfather had indeed summoned the Jinn, but he had failed to control it. The entity was now free, bound only to the house itself, and anyone who entered was at its mercy. That night the whispers returned, but they were no longer confined to a single room. They followed me throughout the house, growing louder and more menacing. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and writhing as if alive. At midnight, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the battery, which had been fully charged, was inexplicably dead. Then came the footsteps. They started in the attic, slow and deliberate, before descending the stairs. Each step was measured, as if the entity was savoring the moment. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, clutching the amulet tightly. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a deep, guttural voice echoed through the house. "You cannot escape." The next few days were a waking nightmare. The Jinn's presence became increasingly aggressive. Objects moved on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, doors slamming shut, and pictures falling from the walls. One night I woke to find myself unable to move, paralyzed by an unseen force. The room grew unbearably cold, and I could feel the entity's breath on my face. It whispered in my ear, its voice a blend of rage and mockery. "You are mine." When I finally broke free from the paralysis, I packed a bag and fled to the village. The villagers, though sympathetic, were hesitant to get involved. "The Jinn is powerful," the old man who had given me the amulet said. "It feeds on fear and anger. You must remain strong." The cleric who had performed the initial cleansing offered to help again, this time with a more elaborate ritual. He explained that the Jinn could not be destroyed. It was part of another realm, one that was beyond human control. However, it could be bound, its influence weakened. The ritual required preparation. For 3 days I fasted and prayed, following the cleric's instructions to the letter. Meanwhile, the villagers gathered sacred herbs and prepared the tools needed for the ceremony. On the night of the ritual, I returned to the house with the cleric and several villagers. The atmosphere was electric, charged with both fear and determination. We began in the living room, where the cleric lit incense and began chanting verses from the Quran. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the room seemed to ripple. As the chanting intensified, the jinn made its presence known. The temperature plummeted, and a deafening roar filled the house. The lights flickered violently, and the walls seemed to shake. The cleric shouted over the noise, commanding the entity to reveal itself. Suddenly the jinn appeared, a towering figure of smoke and shadow, its glowing eyes filled with malice. The jinn lashed out, its presence almost tangible as it pushed against the barriers the cleric was creating. The villagers joined in, chanting and throwing the sacred herbs into the fire. I held the amulet tightly, reciting the prayers I had been taught. The jinn turned its gaze toward me, and I felt an overwhelming wave of hatred and anger. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I would pass out. But then something shifted. The amulet grew warm in my hand, and the jinn let out a furious scream. The cleric's chants grew louder, and the entity began to dissipate, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. When the ritual was over, the house was eerily quiet. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the air felt clean for the first time in weeks. The cleric warned me that while the jinn was bound, it was not gone. Its presence would remain tied to the house, dormant but not destroyed. I left the village the next day, vowing never to return to the house. If the ritual had brought me any peace, it was fleeting. The jinn may have been bound, but its curse lingered like an invisible noose tightening around my soul. What followed was not just the resolution of a terrifying chapter in my life, but the uncovering of truths that changed everything I thought I knew about my family, myself, and the world beyond our own. After leaving the ancestral home, I thought I had escaped the jinn's wrath. I stayed with a friend in the city, trying to put the horrifying events behind me. For a while, life seemed normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an ordeal. But the dreams began almost immediately. Every night I found myself back in the house, wandering its dimly lit halls. The whispers were there, faint at first, but growing louder with each step I took. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sensation of cold fingers brushing against my skin still fresh. Worse, I started noticing subtle, inexplicable things in my waking life. Shadows moved where no one stood. Lights flickered in patterns that felt deliberate, almost as if the jinn was trying to communicate. One night, as I stared into the bathroom mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. For a brief moment, my reflection wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was gaunt and hollow, its eyes glowing faintly. The jinn wasn't bound to the house. It was bound to me. I returned to the village, desperate for answers. The cleric who had performed the ritual was hesitant to speak with me. "The entity's attachment to you is stronger than I thought," he said. "You are tied to it in ways that even I do not fully understand." Determined to get to the bottom of this, I began digging deeper into my family's history. What I uncovered was a secret my family had tried to bury for generations. My great-grandfather hadn't just summoned the jinn out of curiosity or arrogance. He had made a pact, a desperate, dark deal to protect our family during a time of great turmoil. The jinn was meant to serve him, but when he failed to uphold his end of the bargain, the entity turned vengeful, cursing our bloodline. The curse wasn't just tied to the house. It was tied to us. Realizing I couldn't live like this, I resolved to confront the jinn once and for all. The cleric warned me against it, saying it was too dangerous, but I had no choice. The entity was destroying my life piece by piece, and if I didn't face it, I knew it would claim me entirely. I returned to the ancestral home one last time, armed with every protective charm and sacred text I could find. The house greeted me like an old foe, its walls alive with malevolence. I began the ritual at midnight, alone. The air grew heavy as I chanted, the words trembling on my lips. Shadows gathered around me, coalescing into the form of the Jinn. It towered over me, its eyes burning with fury. Its voice shook the very walls of the house. "You cannot defy me," it hissed. "You are mine." But I didn't stop. I continued the ritual, pouring every ounce of strength and faith I had into the words. The Jinn lashed out, its smoky tendrils wrapping around me, choking the air from my lungs. For a moment I thought it would win. My vision darkened, and the world seemed to slip away. But then, the amulet around my neck grew unbearably hot, a searing light bursting forth from it. The Jinn let out a deafening scream as the light consumed it, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. When the light faded, the house was silent. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. I knew the Jinn was defeated, but at what cost? I left the house that night, vowing never to return. The curse, I hoped, was broken, but the scars it left on me would never heal. Even now, I feel its shadow in my life, a faint reminder of the darkness I faced. I tell my story not to scare you, but to warn you. There are forces in this world we cannot fully understand. And sometimes, when you call out to them, they answer. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.